Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us at the Center for American Women and Politics for this briefing on women in election 2024. I just want to note that we are recording this briefing, and for over 50 years, we at the Center for American Women and Politics have been monitoring the trends, collecting the data, conducting the research, and providing the context that tells the story of women's participation in American politics. And our briefing today is exactly that. We will be focusing on key data points related to women candidates and political donors in election 2024, as well as other election-related topics that we are watching through gender and intersectional lenses. We're going to start our presentation on these topics, but please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A feature throughout, and we will respond to questions at the end. We do ask that when you submit a question, you include your affiliation. And finally, throughout this briefing, we will be referring to CAWP data resources. And my colleague, Kai Barrios, will be putting direct links in the chat as we discuss data available at each of these web pages. And we recommend bookmarking these links for updates throughout the remainder of the election cycle. Well, you all must think that we were incredibly prescient here at the Center for American Women and Politics when we postponed our briefing last week and moved it to today. I assure you we did not know what was coming starting on Sunday. And we certainly cannot hold today's briefing on women in U.S. politics and election 2024 without first addressing this major news of the past week. We certainly don't need to tell any of you that the state of play for women and the presidency has changed significantly and swiftly since Sunday. As of last night, Vice President Kamala Harris secured the support of enough delegates to ensure that she will be the Democratic nominee for president. This makes her the first Black woman and the first Asian American person to win a major party nomination for President of the United States. She will also be just the second woman to be a major party presidential nominee. Should she go on to win in November, she will shatter what Hillary Clinton coined the highest, hardest glass ceiling in American politics. Our research and programming have long been oriented towards changing the perception of power, and this transformative moment would forever alter how Americans view leadership in politics. Our experts at CAWP are prepared to provide important context, expertise, and research to the current political moment, as well as to offer analysis of what's happening now and what is yet to come. As a reminder, we have a section on our site dedicated to women in presidential politics called Presidential Watch 2024, and Kai is sharing that link in the chat right now. And while we will have much more to say in the next few months, my colleague Kelly Dittmar and I will outline a few initial points of context and clarity in the current presidential contest. First, Kamala Harris is electable. A persistent barrier facing women, and specifically women of color, in U.S. politics is the perception that they cannot win over electorates that have long selected white men. This electability bias works to the advantage of white men in politics, but it is one that can be combated and overcome. Already, a woman won the national popular vote for president. A record number of women have won gubernatorial offices nationwide. Women have been essential to flipping the most competitive seats in recent election years, and women of color have been winning both statewide executive and legislative seats in states and districts with majority white electorates. And of course, Kamala Harris herself won the vice presidency 4 years ago. Second, women voters are key to every election, no matter who is on the ballot. They outnumber and outvote men, as we detail in our resources on women voters, but they are also not monolithic. The past 3 election cycles should have made that very clear to those who have made false assumptions about women's voting behavior and preferences prior to 2016. And 2024 will be another year where we focus more on the differences among women instead of trying to determine how women writ large will behave. Perhaps most directly helpful to you, our website features data on women voters from past presidential contests, broken down by intersections of gender and other axes of identity, including race, age, and education. We look at voter registration, turnout, and presidential vote choice. As we all consider the outcome of this fall's feature contest, these trends are essential context to have. Third, party trumps gender and race in voting, but it's fair to evaluate if and how the vice president's identities might generate enthusiasm and affinity among voters. Women don't simply vote for women, and we wouldn't expect that in 2024. But gender and intersectional identities are tied to lived experiences and perspectives that can be leveraged as values added to a campaign and an office holding. At least some of the strong enthusiasm for and even defense of Harris and her campaign that we have seen already is reflecting that. That enthusiasm is reflected through the record-setting fundraising from the first 24 hours of the campaign's launch, as well as in the 44,000 Black women who signed on to an organizing call backing Harris on Sunday night. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and CAWP's Director of Research, Kelly Dittmar, who will speak to some additional points of context for gender, race, and the presidential election. Kelly?
Thanks, Debbie. To Debbie's point about identities, these identities, gender, race among them, will engender as well distinctly negative reactions and evaluations. And so we also need to be cognizant of that. For the past 4 years, Trump's campaign and the Republican establishment has been targeting Kamala Harris, using her as the face of the Biden-Harris ticket in 2020, as well as 2024, and then the Biden administration to paint it as quote unquote radical or dangerous. And those attacks rely on both gendered and racialized stereotypes and are more easily levied upon a Black woman than a white man, regardless of her actual politics. We've also seen attacks on Harris's qualifications, something more common to women and especially to women of color, whose competencies are more often questioned, while for white men, they are more often assumed. And the attacks have already come, but will be amplified, that sexualize her to try to demean her seriousness and her qualifications. And that focus on style, we already are hearing about laughing Kamala. That focus on style over substance is an attempt to diminish beliefs that she is quote unquote presidential. All of these attacks and the degree to which they resonate reflect the persistent dominance of masculinity and whiteness in presidential politics. And we see candidates and campaigns double down on these status quo dynamics in messaging and presentation. In just the last week and a half at the RNC, we saw Trump and his running mate J.D. Vance emphasize the masculinity of their party and themselves as markers of their fitness to lead the nation. But as Debbie noted, these strategies aren't going unnoticed or unchecked, and neither are the sexist and racist attacks that have been waged already against Harris. Unlike in some previous campaigns, there's more attention to these dynamics, as well as organized efforts to stand against them, including third-party organizing online and in media to push back against unfair treatment or claims. And I want to give a credit here to members of the media who are raising questions and analyzing what's happening through gender and intersectional lenses to ensure more accurate assessment and understanding of all of these factors that are at play. So while we know attention is currently focused on the presidential level, we do want to emphasize that there are also a lot of stories to tell down ballot for women in election 2024. So we hope you'll stick with us, and we're going to walk through some more important updates regarding women running, potentially winning office in 2024, and women as donors in this cycle. With that, I'm going to pass it on to CAWP's Data Director, Chelsea Hill, to get us started on those points.
Hi, everyone. We want to start by reviewing some key data points related to the total number of women candidates running for the U.S. House, U.S. Senate, and governor in 2024. All of our data includes major party candidates, with third-party candidates only included if they are incumbents or at other levels of office are competing in nonpartisan contests. Also important to note is that our current count of filed major party candidates include candidates in all states, but filings are still in need of certification in one more state, meaning that there could be some minor changes. Relatedly, we always want to give the caveat that candidates in states where primaries have not yet happened could still drop out of their contests. Because we only include candidates who filed and appeared on primary ballots, we would remove them from our counts. Likewise, overall candidate counts can increase if nominees are replaced later in the cycle for any reason. We don't expect this to significantly change numbers at this point, but we'd always recommend going to our candidate summary and/or just reaching out to us directly for the most up-to-date counts. After successive election cycles where multiple new candidate records were attained by women, candidacies in both chambers of Congress have dropped in election 2024. In both chambers, candidate counts are much closer to where they were in 2018 than to numbers for 2020 and 2022. Neither Democratic nor Republican women have set candidacy records at the federal level in 2024, whether for the U.S. House or Senate. But as these graphs illustrate, the drop for Republican women from 2022 to 2024 has been larger in both number and percentage than the decline in Democratic women candidates in either chamber. While the number of Republican women House candidates dropped by about 36% from 2022 to 2024, Democratic women's candidacies are down by 6.8%. Likewise, Democratic women's Senate candidacies are down by 9.4%, while the number of Republican women Senate candidates is down by nearly 45% from 2022 to 2024. But women are not alone in this trend. The total number of candidates for the U.S. House and Senate, women and men, have declined from 2022 to 2024. In the Senate, where counts are smaller, Republican women saw the largest and Democratic women saw the smallest percentage drop in candidacies of any party by gender group. In the House, the party trend is most stark. While Democratic men and Democratic women both saw drops in candidacies by between 7 and 10%, the percentage decline in Republican House candidates is larger, with the largest percentage drop among Republican women. What this means is that we must be attentive to both partisan and gender trends, instead of signaling these drops as entirely distinct to women. Another way to characterize women's candidacies is to consider women as a percentage of all candidates. We are keeping this data updated on our website for both House and Senate candidates and nominees. As of today, with all states included in our all gender data, women are 26.7% of U.S. House candidates, including 37.5% of Democratic and 17.6% of Republican candidates for the U.S. House. These are not much different than 2022, but the more significant drop for Republican women candidates is evident in this measure. Women are 23.4% of U.S. Senate candidates, including 33% of Democratic and 16.8% of Republican candidates. These are lower than percentages in 2022 for Republican women, but higher for Democratic women. Lastly, you all should have received our press release last week on counts for women candidates by race and ethnicity. In the release, we provide more information about the self-identification process by which we code race and ethnicity. There remain some candidates for whom we do not have racial identifications. Some candidates might provide that identification to us later, and/or, as with our total counts, some candidates might still drop off of remaining primary ballots. Any of these things could alter our final counts by the end of this cycle. In U.S. House contests, the number of women candidates is down in nearly every racial and ethnic category since 2022. As of now, just a single new congressional candidate record has been achieved this year at the intersection of gender and race and ethnicity. The number of Latina/Hispanic women running for U.S. Senate is four is higher than the previous record of 3 set in 2022. For additional context, we only began including MENA as a category in 2018, and from 2004 to 2019, we only used a Native American category to capture Native women candidates. We added Alaska Native as a category of self-identification in our data collection starting in 2019, and Native Hawaiian as a category for self-identification in our data collecting starting in 2021. This means that our current counts are not directly comparable to previous years. Here we only report 2022 and 2024 data since they are most directly comparable.
I want to talk for a second about the potential causes for this. So while we don't have sufficient data to explain what has exactly precipitated these trends, there are a few possible contributors that we can at least flag. One is electoral opportunity. The 2022 elections were contested following the redistricting, a process that can create more vacancies and greater competitiveness. A blunt measure of opportunity is the number of open seat contests, which are likely to attract more candidates across different cycles. There are currently 49 open seat US contests, I guess actually up one after, unfortunately, this weekend, while there were 60 open seat House contests 2 years ago at the primary election stage. I should note that among the 2024 open seats, about 50% favor Republicans. So that doesn't really explain the partisan difference, at least at that opportunity level. Perhaps, as another possible cause, candidates in these groupings held back on running where they felt they couldn't be successful. So this is a strategic calculation. If Republican women, for example, are running in contests where they're especially likely to advance to nomination, then the aggregate candidate count may be a less ominous indicator. So we'll be able to determine this, if this is true, once we have primary and general election win rates, and we'll obviously keep you all updated. Toxicity. The unpopularity of Congress can affect the willingness to run, as can perceptions that it's a toxic place to work. The perceived toxicity extends to harassment and abuse faced by office holders, and we know that that abuse is gendered and racialized, and that it can discourage women, and especially women of color, from running. Finally, our existing research shows that gridlock, whether it's real or perceived in Congress, can dissuade people, and especially women, from running because of their motivation to make policy change. If Congress isn't a place to do that, they're going to look to other sites for political influence and power. And finally, we have to pay attention to targeted recruitment and support. While there was great attention to progressive women's mobilization and recruitment after election 2016, and then a reactive mobilization among Republican women after 2018, it may be that the inconsistency in attention, whether by donors, by media, or others, to targeted recruitment and support for women has affected the candidate numbers this year.
As you all know, 2024 is an off year for statewide executive contests, including governor. This year, gubernatorial elections are being held in 11 states, in contrast to the 36 gubernatorial races held in 2022. While the 17 women who were major party candidates for governor in 2024 is far lower than the record 69 that ran 2 years ago, this is 6 more women gubernatorial candidates than in 2020, the last time there were 11 gubernatorial contests. As you can see, however, only the number of Democratic women candidates is up from 2020. Women are 20.2% of gubernatorial candidates this year, including 30.3% of Democratic and 13.7% of Republican candidates for governor. This is significantly higher for Democrats and about equal for Republicans to the representation of women among 2020 gubernatorial candidates.
I want to move on to talk about nominees. We keep track of the number of women who have won nominations for congressional, gubernatorial, and other statewide executive and state legislative offices on our candidate summary. As of today, primaries have been held in 31 of 50 states. At this point in the cycle, women are 28.6% of U.S. House nominees, including 41% of Democratic and 16.4% of Republican nominees for the U.S. House. These are lower than percentages in 2020 and 2022 overall and for women in both parties. When it comes to the Senate, women are 23.7% of U.S. Senate nominees thus far, including 33.3% of Democratic and 15.8% of Republican nominees for the Senate. Again, these are the lowest percentages across the last 4 cycles, though only 50% of Senate nominees have been selected thus far this year, so it could change. Women are 8.3% of the 12 gubernatorial nominees already selected in 24, including 16.7% of Democratic and 0% of Republican nominees for governor. It's notable that there are no incumbent women governors up for election this year, so that's not a particular dynamic to watch. It's important to say, again, that these percentages will likely change, and they're sensitive to the total number of contests, so you're going to see more fluctuation in Senate and gubernatorial numbers. As of today, we haven't reached any nominee records for House, Senate, or governor. While there remains a possibility of matching or exceeding previous highs in Senate nominees, based on the total number of nominations left, there appears no current path to meeting or exceeding House records for women nominees, overall or in either party. And so you can continue to track these on our candidate summary, which is linked in the chat. And while we don't post running counts on race and ethnicity in terms of nominations, we're happy to provide them upon request. At present, again, it doesn't look like we're going to meet or exceed women nominee records for women within any racial and ethnic group. And this includes Latina Senate candidates. We said earlier that that was the only candidate record, but this would be for nominees. So it doesn't seem like we'll achieve that nominee record this year. And while we're always reluctant to be in the game of electoral predictions, we understand that many on this call are probably interested, as are we, in where we may end up in terms of women's representation after November's elections. At the least, we can lay out some important counts to consider in making this type of prediction, and we'll be better able to do this as all the primaries wrap up. And we plan to hold another briefing after the primaries and prior to Election Day where we can discuss all of this in more detail. But let's start with the House. We have 3 key data points to watch that are in flux at this point, but give us a good guess on where we're going to land in November. So first, incumbent women. We know a record 13 women incumbents in the U.S. House have either decided not to run for re-election or are running for other offices. And with the loss of Representative Sheila Jackson Lee last weekend, that increases the number of incumbent women who will not be on general election ballots to 14. To date, no incumbent women have lost their primaries, so we haven't added any there, but Barbara Lee and Katie Porter were unsuccessful in their bids for another office, the Senate in California. So we start here because this means we need at least this number of pickups for women to stay level in terms of women's representation. Next, we're going to look for women nominees, incumbents and non-incumbents who are running in contests where their party is strongly or likely favored to win. And here I want to credit Cook Political Report. That's the ratings we use to give us a sense of this. Right now, there are 10 non-incumbent women nominees currently in that category, representing the most likely pickups for women across these levels of office, again, with primaries in 31 states already held. This list grows and will grow as primaries conclude, and we'll continue to flag those likely pickups in our post-election reports the day after every primary election, as well, again, in our future briefing. Finally, we evaluate the number of women in competitive contests. These are coded as lean or toss-up by Cook. Here you have 9 vulnerable incumbents and 9 non-incumbents who could pick up especially competitive seats. Of the women listed in these categories, which include 4 incumbents and 2 challengers, are in all women contests. And so in those cases, we can say pretty much for sure that a woman will keep or win that seat. So together, these data points offer a path towards increasing women's House representation in 2025, even with those 19 primary contests left to go. But they also don't show any definite increase or surge come January. So as a reminder, the record for new women entering office was 36, set in 2018. We don't seem on path to match or exceed that record. This outlook for the Senate uses the same logic, but includes all contests, so not just those that have held primaries, including states where primaries have yet to happen. And based on what we know, again, it's unlikely that we're going to see a net increase of more than 1 woman in the Senate come 2025, with the very real possibility of stasis or decline. Debbie, did you want to speak?
No.
Right. I'm going to keep going. No problem. The most likely pickups will come from 2 Black women, Lisa Blunt Rochester in Delaware and Angela Also Brooks in Maryland. And as a reminder, just 3 Black women have ever served in the U.S. Senate, and never more than 1 Black woman has served at one time. Finally, among the gubernatorial contests this year, the best prospects for women are in New Hampshire, where former Senator Kelly Ayotte is running a competitive race for the Republican nomination, and 2 women, Manchester Mayor Joyce Craig and Cindy Warmington, are in a tight contest for the Democratic nomination. And then in Delaware, where Lieutenant Governor Bethany Hall-Lung is in a very tight contest for the Democratic nomination, which is expected to be determinative of who will become the next governor.
I also want to flag that we also keep track of women versus women general election contests for the U.S. House, U.S. Senate, and Governor, and we have data on this going back throughout history. Again, this is including major party nominees only. Both the current and historical lists are available on our website. Another resource that might be of interest to you is our tracking of women who are what we call rebound candidates. or those who are running again in 2024 after running and losing in 2022. This list includes women candidates who ran for either congressional or statewide executive contests in both years and indicates whether or not they are running for the same or different offices this cycle, as well as if they were nominees or not in 2022. We also want to be clear that while we have focused on the U.S. House, U.S. Senate, and gubernatorial contests in this briefing, we have current and historic data on women candidates for other statewide executive offices and state legislatures. In fact, this is our second cycle reporting out data on women state legislative candidates, not only nominees, with the ability to compare them to 2020 and 2022. Our statewide executive data and summary counts at the state legislative level are already available on our candidate summary, but you can also find helpful state-by-state comparisons of state legislative nominees over time at the page linked in the chat. These will be updated as primaries conclude.
While we're not going to go deeply into state legislative trends, I do want to flag a few data points that are worth paying attention to as we move closer to the end of the primary election season. So using data from 25 states where state house primaries have already happened, the total number of major party state house candidates is down from 2022 to 2024. And this is including men and women. But this is a partisan trend, where Republican candidates are down by around 12% and Democratic candidates down by about 4%. Gender also matters here. At the intersection of gender and party, Democratic women are the only group seeing an increase in state legislative candidates from 2022 to 2024. And that's including their male counterparts who are effectively even, as you can see on this chart. State House candidacies are down from 2022 to 2024 for Republican women and Republican men. And we can't say for sure why Democratic women stand out here. But I would add to the points I made earlier at the federal level that it may well be that recruitment efforts and strategic motivation in 2024 is focused on states where key policies, including but not limited to reproductive rights, are being debated and legislated. Also, one more notable fact is that at least with over half of the state house primaries completed, women are almost 50% of Democratic candidates and about 1/4 of Republicans running this year. I'm going to move us forward in the interest of time, and Debbie will speak a bit to our milestones.
So thanks, Kelly. While this does not appear to be a record-setting year for women candidates, as we've heard, we do expect to see several milestones for women in the 2024 election, not just at the top of the ticket. These include firsts for women in certain roles and for women of specific racial and ethnic backgrounds and within either party. We will also watch for circumstances where women might achieve parity as office holders within states or parties as a result of the election, for example, state legislative chambers. It's too early to tell for many of these, but our primary election results posts point to milestones to watch within each state. Some of those are listed here with particular attention to the cases where contests are deemed especially competitive or favoring the milestone achieving women candidates. I'm just going to mention a few, which is Sarah McBride, Democrat in Delaware, who is poised to become the first transgender woman in Congress. Julie Fedorchak, Republican from North Dakota, who is poised to become the first woman to represent North Dakota in the U.S. House of Representatives. Angela Also Brooks, a Democrat from Maryland, is poised to become the first Black woman elected statewide in Maryland, including for the U.S. Senate. Also Brooks, along with Lisa Blunt Rochester, Democrat from Delaware, who is likely to become the first Black woman elected to the Senate from Delaware. The two of them would become the first time we have had two Black women serving simultaneously in the United States Senate. And they will be the first Black women to serve in the U.S. Senate from states other than California and Illinois. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Kira Sanbonmatsu, senior scholar at CAWP and a professor of political science, to talk about the research that she has been conducting and the work we've been doing on women, money, and politics in this election cycle. Kira.
Thanks, Debbie. We're working on this project because the money and politics space has often been a source of disadvantage for women, and traditionally women candidates haven't had the benefits of incumbency. They don't have the same financial networks or personal resources of men. challenges that are particularly acute for women from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. So we're working on a project in collaboration with Open Secrets, and we're grateful to Pivotal Ventures for the funding that makes this research possible. This is the first cycle that CAWP is following the money during the cycle instead of post-election. And of course, money is only one factor in elections, but women need resources to run campaigns and to get on the ballot in the first place. And speaking of which, although this isn't part of what I was planning to talk about today, and speaking of getting to the ballot in the first place, you probably noticed that Kamala Harris's campaign made fundraising history yesterday. Her campaign announced that she had raised $81 million in the first 24 hours of her campaign, with over 888,000 grassroots donors, most of whom made the first contribution of the cycle, the most raised in a single day in history ever for any candidate. So those numbers speak for themselves, but I'll note that those numbers should also permanently dispel the notion that women can't raise the money, especially women of color. And the new donors she's activated will have a relationship with her candidacy going into November. So we'll be watching to see what impact her candidacy and fundraising will have down ballot. And it's already having an impact there. And I think it's worth noting that this important development not only reflects Harris's strength as a candidate, but the culmination of the work that women's organizations and donor networks have been doing, the innovative strategies they've been developing to tap and mobilize women donors behind the scenes, including Black women's organizations, as Debbie mentioned at the start of our program. So the findings I want to share with you today are not about Harris, but about our ongoing project, the Women, Money, and Politics Watch. And we recently received some new data from Open Secrets that I want to preview. We're going to be launching the national view of our section of our website, and this is going to look at all congressional races for candidates who are still in the running. And as I mentioned, we know that fundraising can be a difficult space for women candidates, and what we're seeing for some of the most competitive races is that on average, if you look at the most recent filings for the country and the most competitive races, according to Cook Political Report, on average, the total raised from individual donors combined with self-financing statistics show that on average, men are raising more than women in these key races. But if you look at specific matchups of mixed gender races, women are usually leading their opponents. So depends on what statistic you're looking at, but definitely women, as Kelly and Chelsea already mentioned, are running in some of the top races, and they're often leading the money race there. In terms of self-financing, the amount of money that men and women are contributing to their own congressional campaigns across the country, we continue to see that women are less likely to be providing their own funds to their candidacies, and this can put women at a disadvantage. The third statistic we're tracking is about small contributions, and here we continue to see across the country that women candidates on average are more likely than men to be raising contributions of $200 or less. We also have been looking at that summary total data for men and women candidates. We also are looking at itemized data and some special supplemental data that Open Secrets has provided us from Act Blue and Win Red for the small contributions. And what we are seeing there is that women candidates usually have an average contribution that is smaller than men's, lower amount, and women candidates less likely to have large contributions of $1,000 or more. These differences are less pronounced for men and women running for the U.S. Senate as Democrats. But we continue to see some differences in how men and women are raising money for their campaigns. What we've already released, so those are some findings that we're going to be rolling out in this national view of our webpage in a couple of weeks. We've already been following 10 focus states, mostly battleground states, and what we're calling our deep dive. And you can interact with our data on congressional elections and also state elections with our data visualizations powered by Graphicacy. And so you can look at these statistics that I was just offering here. And then another section of the website that we are calling our donor gaps section. You can look at our analysis of the role that men and women are playing as donors and what we're seeing there in our 10 key focus states. And what we've seen there is that the total money that women contribute to elections is less than what men are contributing. This is before yesterday. We haven't had a chance to look at those data yet, of course. And so we also know that women are providing donations in smaller amounts. Women are disproportionately giving to women candidates. They're disproportionately giving to Democratic candidates. And we are seeing that women of color are especially underrepresented as donors. So going forward, we're going to be adding to this analysis, as I mentioned, by extending to the 50 states. And then we're also going to be looking at an in-depth look nationally at donor demographics for congressional races. Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you, Kira. And thank you all for listening so attentively through an awful lot of information. I want to just give you a bit of a sense of what will be coming in the next few months. The next primary is on July 30th in Arizona, and we will be posting results to that. The virtual roll call vote of delegates for the Democratic Convention will be held by August 7th. And that should result in the official nomination of Harris as the Democratic candidate for president in November. In addition, we plan to release around the end of September our final data on state legislative nominees and nominees across all levels of office compared to records and previous years and by party. In mid-August, we'll be launching our Women, Money, and Politics Watch national page featuring campaign finance analysis in all congressional elections. In early September, we'll launch the Donor Demographics national perspective on all congressional races, and we'll add state election data for our 10 focus states. And we also plan to do another briefing between the end of the primaries and the general election. I want to open it up to questions again. And again, please put all your questions in the Q&A and do include your affiliation. We do have quite a few questions coming in. If we don't get to everyone, I would like to just reiterate that you can feel free to reach out to any of us at any time, particularly questions about the data, or if you see something quirky or that you would like some more explanation about, we probably can explain it, and we can share our background data with you as well. So I am going to start off, and I'm asking my colleagues to also note if there's a question that one of you ask that I don't get to, that they really are dying for, they're gonna just chime in as well. So we're gonna start with our friend from the 19th, Dariona Davis from the 19th. She says, though nonpartisan, what role or impact do you see Black sororities play in mobilizing voters and defining the presidential election?
I'll do a quick start, and then I think others could surely jump in. I mean, I think what we're seeing, one of the things that we have researched is we've tried to understand what are the support infrastructures available to women in American politics. And I think in our recent project, Rethinking Women's Political Power, what we could very well see was that support infrastructures are not serving all women. So traditional women's political organizations don't necessarily serve all groups of women of color at the intersections of race and gender. Where sororities fit there in many ways, particularly for Black women's sororities, is to be a type of support infrastructure and network that I think Kira could speak to a little more in terms of the potential to help with fundraising, right? But also mobilization in terms of engagement and support. And what we're also seeing in the case of Kamala Harris is that that is a contingent that is also available to be part of the quote unquote K-hive, right? The backing of and standing up and pushing back against the negative misinformation, disinformation, and harassment. So I would just commend to you, if you haven't already, Dariona, you've probably already seen it, but Pearl Dow's work on this, on Black women in politics, where she digs deep and does interviews with sorority members about how sororities play an important role in Black women's political trajectories.
Carrie also sort of asks a follow-up or a connected question about what is the root of some Black women saying that they'll vote for Kamala Harris but not believing that she can win. I think we saw that when Barack Obama ran for president, right? There was this concern. Yes, there was support, although that support really mobilized after he won in Iowa. But we really saw that idea that there was support, but a fear for him, but also concern that he couldn't win. I will also open this up to my colleagues, but I would think that a large part of that comes from personally confronting the kind of racism and sexism that they would anticipate Kamala Harris coming up against in a fight like this. So I would think that that would weigh heavily in a concern about her belief that she can win. But I would go back to what we had said earlier at the very beginning of our conversation about electability. Clearly, she won as vice president, and she's won a U.S. Senate race, was state attorney general, and we've seen women of color breaking those barriers as well. Although I will acknowledge we have never seen a Black woman elected governor of any state in the country. Does anyone?
I mean, I think it's kind of,
Okay. Go ahead,
yeah, it's
Chelsea.
kind of twofold too, because it's one, it's like a fear of the kind of, harassment and, racialized attacks that will happen to her as the nominee throughout the campaign cycle, but also the fear of if she does not win, like what the responsibility of Black women is like, oh, well, we ran a Black woman and she couldn't win, like kind of like the force of feeling that on the shoulders. But this is something that like I've heard like anecdotally, like since this has happened, like, oh, well, can she win? And I always like caution against the self-fulfilling prophecy of like, she is not electable, so we didn't elect her. But it's like that's you can't like, you worry about falling into that trap. So, and I think there's a little bit of a advantage in the kind of strangeness of how this has all come about, where it's like, do we even have time for the electability conversation? Like it's like the train has left the station. So I'm hoping that will be something that people take into account when talking about this like electability question when it comes to Kamala Harris.
I just want to say she's electable if you vote for her. And then also just this piece, I think, to Dariana's point, kind of tying these questions together, which is the folks who are making the best case of Kamala Harris's electability are the 44,000 Black women that got on the phone for 4 hours, on a strategic call on Sunday night. And so, yes, there's that fear, but on the flip side, there's active work being done to push back against those electability biases.
I guess I would just jump in and say that the fundraising that we've been talking about that she's accomplished this week, I don't think we saw that coming. And I think it speaks to the unification of the party around her. And I think that speaks to the enthusiasm that Democratic voters will have for her in the fall. So I think it's, she's running in a very specific race against a specific opponent, and the grassroots have spoken this week and very powerfully.
Harriet from CNBC asks, do you have data on largest individual female donors? I think probably following up on some of what we saw in the New York Times article this morning of the mobilization of some big donors, women donors supporting Kamala Harris. Kira?
That article, I think I would refer you to that article and those names there that have been working behind the scenes, as I mentioned, on behalf of women candidates for quite some time. In our data, we're actually matching individual contributors to the voter file with data from Catalyst. So we are aggregating that information, and we're protecting privacy. So in our data, we're not actually able to reveal individuals, but we are looking aggregate at the role of men and women as donors.
Leah from AP asks, are there any gubernatorial or state legislative races that you think are particularly interesting from a campaign finance perspective? Thank you.
Well, we're really excited to have this data for state legislative and statewide races on our website from Open Secrets. And we've been getting that data from them for our key focus 10 states as it rolls in. So that data is becoming more complete each time we update it. I guess I would say at this point, we are seeing just some trends where women incumbents, Democratic women incumbents are often doing better than men incumbents at the state legislative level, but not in Pennsylvania. As we mentioned earlier, with Republican women's numbers, there are fewer Republican women in our data for comparison. So it's hard to say, but we don't tend to see Republican women usually doing as well fundraising compared to men. And if you look at the top fundraisers in these state races so far, we're not usually seeing women of color come to the top in terms of fundraising numbers, but it's something to watch.
Emily from Politico is very interested in the why so few women. She particularly references, did Kelly say something earlier to the effort of recruitment efforts being focused on more politically conservative, moderate states where women's rights are more at risk? So maybe you want to clarify and expand a little on the why. And then
Yeah,
we can
sure.
chime in with our theories of why.
Absolutely. I think a lot, for any of us right now, these are theories, largely. But I do think what I was speaking to, Emily, was one of the possibilities, right, as we have seen, is that organizations are mobilizing and recruiting candidates to fight either for particular policies, right, or against policies. So I wouldn't say it's only in conservative or moderate states, right? It can be in any states where the idea is, for example, on reproductive rights, we want to make sure we enshrine that, right, into law in some of the more progressive legislatures across the country. So to me, one of the possibilities is that first, women are seeing states as a place to make this either policy change or to play policy defense, right? To intervene in the process. And then add to that a lot of the organizations folks are on this call who are working with, whether it be on the ground, mobilizing organizations on the voter side, or recruitment in terms of women, or just more generally progressive or conservative candidates. I think those groups also have been, doing robust jobs trying to do that type of recruitment within states, recognizing the opportunities that may be there, both in terms of competitive seats, as well as because this is where a lot of this policy, again, if you're talking about things like education, abortion, and many others are being legislated and adjudicated. So a question, right, is part of that mobilization and recruitment and efforts leading into, particularly in this case, Democratic women actually faring better on the candidacy numbers than other groups. And so it could be, and if so, credit to some of these state-based efforts. But Debbie,
I was just wondering, Kelly, if you could also sort of connected to this, speak to the issue of the incumbent Republican women losing in their primaries,
sure.
and just talk a little bit about that. And
Sure. One of the other things that we flagged as another potential storyline, and I've done a brief blog on our website that you can find to watch for, is that incumbent women state legislators, there are some different trends we're seeing. Again, we're midway through the primary process, but almost 80% of all incumbent state legislators who've lost primary elections at this point are Republicans. So there's obviously a partisan story here. Women are also overrepresented among Republican incumbents who've been defeated in state legislative primaries, while they're underrepresented among the defeated Democratic incumbents. So there's the party by gender story. And while the incumbent primary loss rate at present is lower, for Democratic women state legislators than in the three previous cycles. The rate of primary incumbent losses for Republican women state legislators is actually higher in 2024 than in the three previous years. And Chelsea spoke to this in terms of when we have this data most robustly, so 2022, 2020, and 2018. At the same time, women are overrepresented among both Democratic and Republican Republican challengers who've defeated incumbents. So this is the other side of the coin. So while there is this incumbency challenge that seems to be affecting Republican women worst, they are also overrepresented among those challengers who are defeating incumbents in their own state legislative primaries. So we're really looking forward to trying to parse this out as we finish primaries to try to understand what's going on at that point. But to Debbie's point, there's something tied there in terms of Democratic women's kind of successes and Republican women's both drop in candidacies and then also vulnerability as incumbents in these state legislative contests.
We have two more questions. I want to try to get them both in. Daniela from Roll Call, she asks, what role do you think the partisan gender divide is playing in the presidential race, where Republicans have embraced a message targeting male voters? We certainly saw that on that last day of the Republican convention. And how will comments such as J.D. Vance's comments denigrating women candidates such as Vice President Harris, who have not given birth, calling them unhappy cat ladies, hurt the party's chances with women voters?
Debbie, I feel like, do you want to start here? Or
I want to start with this one, yes. So, we have been talking for a long time when we look at this whole idea of elections and not just talking about women, but talking about gender and how masculinity and femininity are used by candidates, by parties in messaging. And clearly that is what we saw during the Republican convention. I was struck in the speeches that I did watch, how often motherhood was referenced by the women who got up there to speak, whether they were a governor or running the party or an elected official at any level. Motherhood was always a note that was struck. But then at the end of the day, it was all about masculinity for J.D. Vance and for Donald Trump. The day that Donald Trump walked into the convention playing with James Brown, "It's a man's world," I thought spoke volumes. And I thought to myself, well, I guess they've just written off women voters here. Or at least those women voters who are at play in this election. I mean, clearly Donald Trump has a group of women voters who are very tied to him and very devoted to him. But in terms of broadening out the tent and pulling in new voters, that certainly wasn't a welcoming message. And then the J.D. Vance has made both, I think, subtle and not so subtle racist and sexist statements about Vice President Harris. The cat lady, women without children are unhappy cat ladies, being probably the most blatant, but even insinuating that Vice President Harris is not grateful to America, which is a dog whistle racist comment, I think does hurt their chances with women voters. I think the whole notion that they were toning down on the Republican side, the messaging to try to do more of that outreach, kind of went out the window on the last day of the convention and seems to be continuing. And I think it will have an impact in terms of those swing voters who are women, and pulling them into the party and broadening their tent.
If Debbie, you've covered it all. I just wanted to one piece, which is when we're talking about the idea, not the idea, the reality that women aren't monolithic, I do want to reinforce that they are playing to a particular type of women voter, as Debbie mentioned, that actually is aligned in some ways with the valuation of masculinity, right? So this is where gender in terms of masculinity, femininity versus male, female, right, doesn't always align. And so we know that, for example, women voters and men voters who support Donald Trump are the most likely to agree with statements like society is becoming too soft and feminine. We're punishing men for behaving like men. So this kind of perception of precarious masculinity, women also believe in that and are concerned about that. And that informs, I think, some of their not only kind of willingness, as some people talk about it as, oh, willingness to support, but actually active support for this type of rhetoric and campaign. And so I don't want to leave out the fact that we do have, as Debbie noted, certainly a contingent of women who do believe that as well, and they've been quite supportive of Donald Trump, and it looks like will continue in terms of their support for JD Vance. But what Debbie's speaking about in terms of kind of swing, absolutely, this is not bringing back voters, women voters that have been lost since 2016.
And our last question comes from Susan Haig, and I don't know your affiliation. So she says, can you apply these ideas to Ambassador Haley? A lack of serious reporting by mainstream media during early primaries, inequitable coverage of top non-incumbent candidates in election stories, Republican Party breach of good faith in okaying former President Trump's bypassing of all Republican primary debates. Was a Republican woman of color as a president impossible for mainstream media to grasp?
Good question.
It's a great question.
Who wants?
Does anyone want to start?
I think
I just mentioned that part of Haley's candidacy, what we saw there was that the anybody but Trump contingent did not coalesce around her, and she turned out to be the strongest candidate. And so I think for the forces within the Republican Party that wanted to see an alternative candidate, there was disagreement about who that strongest candidate was. And you do wonder to what extent Haley's identity played a role in that, and whether the nomination race on the Republican side might have gone differently if she had been taken more seriously as a candidate within her own party, as well as by the media and by the donor class.
And I also want to point that Haley had a really hard road to navigate, and you saw her struggling with which lane she wanted to be in. And I think that also, to Kira's point, her in the coalescing around her, because at the beginning it wasn't as overtly, or it was as overtly anti-Trump, then it was pulling back a little bit, then it was overtly anti-Trump. And I think in the case that somebody would be an effective contrast to him, they needed to go all in, or at least that was my observation, just because he takes up all of the air in the room, as we've seen since 2016. And in order to get attention and traction, you'd have to be pretty firm on where you stand against him. And we saw DeSantis and Haley and others really struggle to define themselves in contrast to Trump. And I think there are absolutely gendered and racialized aspects to that, particularly as well among voters and their willingness to imagine that this was possible. But there was also just a struggle for anybody who was running against Donald Trump in this cycle. And by the way, that'll continue in the general election.
Yeah, I think he was a juggernaut, and no one was sure how to stop it. And I do think that she was not taken seriously by the media in the beginning. I mean, she was really dismissed. And I found that very frustrating. But when the question comes in, how do you get someone to coalesce with the folks who wanted an alternative on the Republican side to Trump? I mean, if there was nobody who was more all in than Chris Christie on that, and that didn't go so well. So I'm not sure there was a path for anyone to really take him on. I mean, I think they each tried to find a way, and no one really could. Well, we're going to close it there. You have all been wonderful, and I've really appreciated the time that you've taken to be with us. I want to just reiterate that we are available. So if we didn't get to your question, please reach out to us individually. We are happy to talk. We love to talk, if you haven't noticed. And we will be sending out a recording of this presentation as well as the PowerPoint slides, and a list of all of the resources that we talked about and that Kai diligently put into the chat, in case you didn't catch them. And we will be in touch over the coming months, and there is lots to come on the women in politics front, and we will be there to collect the data, to analyze it, to put it into a context, and to help create and support the work that you all are doing to tell the story. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.